And Jamie is one of the unique people across our country who is an actuary and does valuations and has a string load of education behind his name. And he looks after pension valuations across the country. So there's not very many that have this expertise, and we're very lucky to have him join us today. And so for those of you that are all across the country, that you will be able to learn a little bit about pensions and how it impacts in your neck of the woods. So I'm going to turn it over to Jamie.
Thank you very much, Linda. So I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to share my screen. I just wanted to comment that, of course, if any of you have questions, there's going to be time at the end for questions. And also, you can always raise your hand. Linda, if you can let me know if somebody's got a question during the presentation, that's fine. We're not going to be in a mad rush for the hour or anything like that. So we have time to make it interactive. So feel free to jump in with questions if you have them, or wait till the end as well. So I'm going to just share my presentation. I will provide a copy of my presentation after to Linda, and I'm sure she'll share it with everybody. Okay. All right, Linda, can you see the presentation?
Yeah, we can see it fine. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about pensions on marriage breakdown across Canada, and to give you a sort of a high level understanding of how they're valued and divided across the country. It does vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but at the beginning, I just wanted to give a bit of background about pensions in general, so you understand sort of the context. For some of you who are very familiar with pensions, that you'll already know this, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody who may be new to pensions understands the terminology and what I'm referring to. So first term I wanted to talk about was a defined contribution pension. They're called DC pensions or defined contribution. These are similar to group RRSPs, but they're technically registered pension plans where an employee and employer contribute to an investment account and they grow with investment return until retirement. And the funds in the account are used to provide retirement income. So they're fairly straightforward plans. And in terms of valuing them across Canada, they're always valued the same way based on the account value at the applicable date, depending on the jurisdiction, similar to RRSPs or other investment accounts. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is that they are still registered pension plans, unlike RRSPs. So the funds, if you're going to divide them and transfer them to a spouse, go to a locked-in RRSP. They don't go into a regular RRSP. And most jurisdictions have a 50% limit. So a member cannot give away more than half of their pension in most jurisdictions. So in terms of valuation and division, it's fairly straightforward, similar to an RRSP, but like I said, there's a few caveats there. And also, they are technically registered pension plans, so you have to follow the rules for registered pension plans. For example, in Ontario, you still need to request a statement of family law value if you want to divide these pensions. But in terms of valuation and division, it's the account value that you're dealing with, nothing complex in this case. So for that reason, the rest of the pension presentation deals with defined benefit pensions, which are the complicated ones. So I just wanted to make that clear. So some pensions are defined contribution. We're going to primarily deal with defined benefit. Defined benefit pensions, they provide a lifetime pension at retirement based on a plan formula. The employee, the member, earns a pension based on credited service. So for salaried workers, usually this is a final average plan or a career average. So it's a certain percentage of their average earnings or their career earnings that accrues over their career. In hourly union plans, it's often flat benefits, something like $30 per year of service per month. And then you do the calculation at retirement. And there you go, you have a pension of $2,000 a month and it pays for your lifetime. As you can probably appreciate, if we're trying to put a value on this type of a pension, if you have a member who's 60 years old and retires with a pension of $2,000 a month or $24,000 a year, how many years is it going to be paid for? It depends how many years he's going to live. If he lives for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, the value can vary quite significantly. So we use actuarial methods to put the present value on this, the actual present value. And there's different ways this can be done. And these pensions being more complicated lead to different approaches in terms of valuation and division across Canada. Somebody's dog barking.
Can we ask people to please mute?
I guess the dog doesn't like defined benefit pension.
Maybe not.
I have a serious question.
Sure. So one thing to keep in mind with defined benefit pensions that this question sometimes comes up is that the way in which they're valued or even divided varies from other assets. So it's done what's called the Prorata on service method. And what happens under this method is you look at either the monthly pension or the value of the pension. And then if you want to do a pre-marriage deduction to recognize the service earned during marriage, the formula I have on the slide is time service during marriage divided by total service. Depends on the jurisdiction, whether what valuation date is being used, et cetera. But this general approach is used across Canada. So for example, if you're in Ontario, if you have a pension that's worth $200,000 and the member was a member of the defined benefit pension plan for half of his years of service at separation, then he gets a $100,000 deduction effectively, and only half of the pension is considered marital property. This is quite different from a defined benefit, defined contribution pension or an RSP, where you look at the value at marriage and the value at separation, you subtract them. Defined benefit pensions are not valued that way. You never value a defined benefit pension at marriage. It's always valued at one date, and then it's prorated on service. I get the question sometimes, why is this? Well, the rationale was laid out largely in a Supreme Court of Canada decision, Best versus Best, in the late 90s. But this formula for defined benefit pensions has been codified in the various legislation across Canada. It's done this way in every jurisdiction. And the general rationale is that a defined benefit pension is not like an investment account. It doesn't have a value at marriage in the same way that an RSP does. What effectively is happening is the member is earning more service and they're getting a larger pension. And the rationale is that it's actually the monthly pension that's being earned over time. So we're prorating on service to recognize a certain portion of that pension was earned during marriage, and the valuation is only done once. So the reason I mention this, if you're thinking, oh, what's my date of marriage deduction for a defined benefit pension? You don't go and get a value at marriage. It's a value at separation, and it's prorated. So you carve off a percentage of the pension to reflect the portion that was earned before marriage or before cohabitation, depending on the jurisdiction. So it is the only asset that, to my knowledge, is valued this way on marriage breakdown, but it is valued this way universally across the country. So it's a different approach. In terms of general background, you should be aware that there's more than two types, but two primary types of defined benefit pension plans are a traditional defined benefit pension plan. So an example of this would be, for example, the bank, CIBC or Royal Bank. They set up a pension plan for their employees. It's defined benefit. The employee may or may not contribute, and then the employee earns a pension over their career, and then they get it for their lifetime in retirement. And if there's not enough money in the pension fund, they don't go back to the employee and say you have to pay more. The employer has to pump in the money to keep the plan funded until the employee dies, unless the employer goes insolvent. And so this is a fairly secure pension. And historically, these were more common. But as you can imagine, these are expensive because the company's on the hook for funding this plan for decades into the future. So they're not as common anymore. What's becoming more common are target benefit pension plans in the defined benefit world. What these are is they often have multiple employers, and there's no deficit funding. What happens is the employers pump money. Sometimes the employees contribute as well. The money's going to the plan, and there's a promised monthly payment, like a defined benefit pension, but it's not guaranteed. So if in 30 years there's not enough money in the plan, they'll have to cut their pension down. The members will get a lifetime pension. It just may not be what the formula says it is. It might be reduced by 10 or 20%, or it might be increased if the plan's doing really well with its investments or otherwise. Traditionally, if you've seen these, say 15 years ago, they were always union plans, like the Carpenters Union. These are the sort of plans they were setting up. They're becoming increasingly common in Canada. So we're, I think, right now experiencing one of the biggest changes in the pension landscape in the last 30 years as these plans are becoming more common. So for example, the province of New Brunswick converted all of its public service plans to these types of pension plans, target benefit type pension plans. And there's a movement in this direction across from coast to coast towards these sort of plans, because the employer has no liability on this. They put the money in for the employee and that's it. And the plan trustees need to work with what they have. And it still gives employees access to defined benefit pension. So I think they're a very, very good plan. And there is plans that are in between. An example would be Ontario teachers or OMERS. They're technically multi-employer plans, but they're not allowed to reduce benefits while they're ongoing. They're obviously very sophisticated, large plans with substantial assets. So their security is generally viewed as being closer to a traditional plan than a target benefit, but they do have characteristics like a target benefit. The reason I'm talking about this is going to become apparent in a bit later when I talk about valuation methodologies. There's a lot of the, I should say not a lot yet, several of the jurisdictions, for example, Alberta, New Brunswick, they've changed their pension division legislation in the last 10 years to, there's different methodologies being used for target benefit pension plans than traditional defined benefit pension plans. And I'm going to talk about that a bit later. So going forward, as I talk about it, I'm going to use the term target benefit pension plan, and I'm referring to these. So they're like I said, we're in a sort of an evolving pension landscape right now, and these plans are becoming more common. And on marriage breakdown, I've had a number of cases that there's problems that are arising with these plans, and I'll talk about that you should be aware of. So in general, that's my background, sort of primer on pensions, so you understand defined contribution, defined benefit, and target benefit pension plans. Now I'm going to I want to move into talking about the main goal of my talk is to talk about pensions on marriage breakdown. So regardless of the jurisdiction, from coast to coast, every single province, family law or matrimonial legislation indicates that pensions are an asset on marriage breakdown to be shared between the spouses. So this is universally the case across Canada. Also, it's also the case that in all provinces, both vested and non-vested pensions are considered assets. So it doesn't matter whether it's an executive supplemental pension or it's a registered pension, they're all assets earned during the marriage or the cohabitation period. The pension or the value of the pension earned during marriage is shared on marriage breakdown. However, there's quite a variation across Canada on exactly how they're valued and divided on marriage breakdown. One thing I wanted to point out, if you're, say, practicing only on Ontario or you're practicing only in BC, and you may think, well, generally you only need to know the rules in your province, but one reason why this sort of perspective is helpful for any of us working in working with marriage breakdown in this sort of area is that people move. So the pension rules that govern the pension division is the province in which the person worked. So if you have somebody who worked in Alberta, left their job and then moved to Ontario, and then they go through a marriage breakdown, that Albertan pension is still an asset, but it can only be divided under the Alberta rules. It can't be divided on the Ontario rules. So you will, if you have clients who have worked and moved in various provinces, it's helpful to understand the division in each province so you understand how each pension can be divided at source, because it will vary depending where the pension was earned. So that's something to keep in mind. Ultimately, the way in which we put a value on these defined benefit pensions on marriage breakdown is a question of law. The actuarial profession has a standard of practice for valuing defined benefit pensions on marriage breakdown. We refer to them as capitalized value of pension benefits on marriage breakdown. I'm calling that the CIA MBSOP, stands for CIA Marriage Breakdown Standard of Practice. That's our set of rules for when actuaries do an independent valuation of a pension for marriage breakdown purposes. That's what we're required to use by our professional standards. There's another professional standard of practice of the Canadian Institute of Actuaries for commuted values, and that's meant for termination values, not meant for marriage breakdown. However, it is commonly the basis used in pension legislation across Canada, and I'll talk about that a bit more. So there's two different standards you need to be aware of: the capitalized value marriage breakdown standard and pension commuted value. They're two different values and two different standards. The value under the CIA marriage breakdown standards of practice, the valuation usually provides results for a range of values. It can include uninvested early retirement benefits, future salary increases, ad hoc pension indexing. This standard was designed to give a very fair and equitable assessment of the pension and all of its potential benefits, so the spouses were fully informed when making an asset settlement on marriage breakdown. And that's why that standard works that way. as I'll talk about in a moment, it's not used in every jurisdiction. In some jurisdictions, the law has sort of overridden that and specifies the value to be used. So there's two issues that arise on marriage breakdown with pensions. The one is valuation. So if you're attempting or you're required to put a value on the pension, how exactly does that happen and what methodology is used? And the second issue is that if the spouses do want to divide the pension at source, so they share the pension, each getting half, how does a division occur? And so those are two separate issues. And the law for pension division is not necessarily the same as the treatment of the pension under family law legislation. So pension division in most provinces is defined under pension benefits legislation. It effectively says, if you want to share this pension, this is how it can occur, and this is how much can be assigned or transferred to the spouse. Family law legislation is the perspective of, as part of this economic partnership of marriage, what's the value or the amount of pension that is required to be shared between the spouses? And those two aren't always the same. That in some provinces, I'll talk about this a bit more later, example, Alberta and Saskatchewan, there's a significant case law that you have the pension standards legislation that allows half the commuted value to be paid out, but the family law recognizes that the pension may be worth more than that, and an independent actuarial evaluation may require an additional payment from the plan member to reflect the additional value of their pension that's not captured in the pension division. And some other provinces, that distinction isn't made. If you have provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, where there is evidence and it's agreed that the pension is worth more than is available through division, then there would need to be additional assets involved in the settlement to reflect the total value of the pension. There's two primary division schemes in Canada for dividing defined benefit pensions on marriage breakdown. So if you have a client who has defined benefit pension, depending which province they worked in, will they earn the pension, or whether it's federal, I'll talk about federal later, will determine what division options are available. So just to be clear, pensions don't need to be divided on marriage breakdown. There's not a single province in Canada that requires pensions to be divided. It's always at the option of the spouses. So they would have to agree, there'd be a court order or separation agreement specifying the division. You can always keep the pensions intact and trade them against other assets, in which case you would definitely need a value to do that, so you know how much it's worth to offset correctly. But in every jurisdiction, you also have the option of different forms of pension division. If the spouses decide, no, I'd like to share, I would like to divide the pension and split it between the two spouses. And the way in which the pension can be divided, as I mentioned previously, depends on the jurisdiction in which the pension was earned, where the individual is working when they receive the pension. So the two division mechanisms for dividing pensions on marriage breakdown in Canada I'm referring to as deferred settlement and immediate settlement. So I'm going to talk about deferred settlement first. Deferred settlement is available in British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. So in all three of these provinces, they have deferred settlement pension division schemes. And how this works in all three of these provinces is if the spouses decide, oh, we want to divide the pension, you fill out the appropriate forms with the separation agreement or court order and give it to the pension plan administrator, and they will make the non-member spouse what's called a limited member of the plan, which means they're basically a member like their spouse, except they don't accrue pension. They have special status under the plan, but they do in fact receive their own lifetime pension from the plan. And in all three of these provinces, the lifetime pension is actually prorata on service of the member's pension in the future at termination of retirement. So this, if they were married for half of the member's years when they retire, they get half of their pension, including their future salary increases and everything else, ad hoc increases in the plan. So these three provinces actually have the most generous division for former spouses. So former spouses in BC, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland have the best pension division option for them. And if retired, the pension payment is split. So I'll talk about this a bit later. Some of these provinces do give the limited member the option to cash out of the pension plan if they choose to, but the default option is they become a member of the pension plan and they receive their own pension. And it's called deferred settlement because the spouse doesn't get money right away. They don't get a cash transfer to a LIRA or locked in RSP. They get their own pension later, just like the member does. In all three of these provinces, payment can be made in lieu of the division, as I had just mentioned. They don't have to do this limited member division. They can say, no, I want to keep my whole pension. Spouse wants to keep the house. Let's offset them. And in all three of these provinces with deferred settlement, if a payment is determined, it's done by an independent actuary using the CIA marriage breakdown standards of practice. In fact, in BC, it's actually largely codified in the law that this approach has to be used. So I would say these three provinces are fairly consistent, and your basic option is either divide at source, former spouse becomes a member of the plan with their own pension, or you get an actuary to determine the capitalized value, and then you offset it. So they're fairly pleasant provinces to do work in because the system's fairly well worked out. Now, immediate settlement is more common, and I would say more problematic, unfortunately, of a way of doing this. So the idea with immediate settlement is that generally, unless the spouse is retired, or the member is retired, I should say, the spouse receives a lump sum transfer out of the pension plan. It's called immediate settlement because the plan pays them out, they get their money in a locked-in RSP, and it's done. They're not a member of the pension plan, they're not receiving their own pension. It's being sort of divided right away. So this applies to Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. Now, the value, what can be paid from the plan, is defined in the legislation. So in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, New Brunswick, it's just the commuted value, which is the same value a member would get if they terminated the pension plan. So they effectively treat them like terminating plan members. So if the spouse in any of these provinces wants their share of the pension, the plan administrator uses the appropriate date to which is generally the date of separation under the pension legislation, and says, okay, we're assuming the member terminated on the date of separation and they would have been entitled to a commuted value transfer of $300,000. The spouse is entitled to half, so they can take $150,000. They pay it out to the spouse locked in RSP, they reduce the member's benefit, and that's that. Okay, but there's some issues with this, as I'll talk about later, because the commuted value doesn't necessarily capture the whole value of the pension. So in this case, sometimes the spouses can be shortchanged and not receive the same value as the member, nowhere near the value often they'd receive as a limited member in BC, Nova Scotia, or Newfoundland. Quebec has a modified commuted value, not significantly modified, but the Quebec legislation takes the commuted value and makes a few small tweaks to it. It's not a substantial change, but it is modified. But it still pays out half of this modified commuted value to the former spouse. And of course, then we have Ontario. Ontario just went off on a tangent in its own direction on this one. It's inconsistent. It would be the one that, since their modification in 2012, stands apart from the rest of the provinces and being quite dramatically different. They went and defined by regulation the Ontario family law value, which for those of us who practice Ontario know, for active members, it's a weighting of 3 commuted values or 2 commuted values based on a complex formula set in the regulations, et cetera. Ontario was attempting to put one value, one size fits all, that's as equitable as possible. Now, I would agree that it tends to be higher in many cases than a commuted value would be, say, in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, New Brunswick. So it's not as negative for the former spouse, but it can be both low and high. But in any case, in Ontario, there is a defined value called the Ontario family law value. And all of these provinces, except Quebec and New Brunswick, if the pension is in pay, even though they're immediate settlement provinces, once the pension's in pay, they don't require the pension plan to pay the commuted value anymore. They literally split the pension and pay. So the pension's $2,000 a month, $1,000 is directed towards the spouse. By default, in these provinces, it's just the pension that's split. The form doesn't change. So when the member dies, the pension ends. Some of these provinces do have the option to convert it to a lifetime pension for the former spouse. So my one advice would be, in general, with these sort of divisions, if you have a pension and pay from one of these provinces and you're going to do the division, just put a bit of thought into survivor benefits. What happens if the member dies? And make sure you're aware of that, and both spouses are aware of that in terms of, is there a survivor pension for the spouse that's in place? Can this pension be converted to a lifetime pension, or will the pension just end? And you probably want to, depending on who you're working with, make sure that in the eventuality that, say, this plan member were to pass away in a year, is the former spouse okay? And is there a source of income or life insurance or whatever needs to be in place? Because some of these jurisdictions, for example, Ontario, unless there's a survivor pension, the member passes away, the pension ends. So if there was no survivor pension, then the former spouse's pension stream ends. So it's just something to keep in mind. And like I said, in Quebec and New Brunswick, it's a lump sum still. So it doesn't matter whether they're retired or they're still working, they still get a lump sum, which again, isn't necessarily ideal for the former spouse. Some former spouses might prefer that, but that means your former spouse, your plan member gets a lifetime pension reduced by half or whatever was earned during marriage. And the former spouse is maybe 65 or 70 and gets a lump sum to their locked-in RSP, and that has to last in their lifetime. And so they could outlive their funds. On the other hand, if the former spouse is sick or ill, they may prefer the lump sum payout so that when they pass away, they can leave it to their estate. So there's pluses and minuses, but in any case, be very careful with pensions and pay in general, I would say, across Canada. Just be cognizant when you're doing the division, what happens when the member dies and what happens when the spouse dies. So you're aware of those. Those two questions are answered by the administrator and they're addressed in the separation agreement, and both spouses are aware of them. So a couple of comments to further expand on these immediate settlement provinces. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, as I mentioned previously, it is the commuted value that's transferred out, which is the termination value, which can be low. It doesn't include unvested early retirement. The courts have accepted for many years in those provinces, you can get an independent actuary to do a evaluation under the CIA marriage breakdown standards of practice, provide evidence of the fair value of the pension under that basis, and then order that even if the pension's divided, if half the commuted value is 100,000, but the independent actuary says the spouse should get 150,000, then the member's got to make the difference up to value the pension as its fair value as per the independent valuation. So I would say in these two provinces, although the pension legislations and maybe not ideal in its sense that it's not as comprehensive as a deferred settlement like in BC, it does, the courts do address the inequity by looking at independent actual evidence to try to ensure an equitable settlement between the spouses. So I think these provinces with independent actual advice can have very fair systems and they work just fine. The two most problematic provinces in Canada, in my opinion, are Manitoba and New Brunswick. Manitoba and New Brunswick, they're like Alberta and Saskatchewan, where it's commuted value that's paid out. But in those two provinces, generally evolved that the commuted value is accepted usually as the value for marriage breakdown purposes, and they're not seeking independent actuarial advice, and they're not the courts and the family law lawyers don't appear to be generally interested in any discussion of whether that's equitable or not. I have done work in both of these provinces, but it's definitely an uphill battle in the context in which those provinces are functioning. So they sort of have the worst of both worlds in the sense that they have this immediate settlement regime, and they also have a system in which there isn't seem to be a tendency to even consider whether that's equitable for the former spouse or the member or not. Now, the one thing that's been changing is going back to target benefit pension plans is that New Brunswick has changed all of its public sector plans into shared risk plans. You have the New Brunswick teachers, New Brunswick public service, New Brunswick nurses, or all these shared risk target benefit plans. So government sort of moved them out of a traditional structure and put them into their own sort of target benefit shared risk. And what's happening is under these shared risk plans, I mentioned this before, they have different rules for valuation. So they're allowed to, in Alberta, they're allowed, and New Brunswick, they're required to use different actuarial assumptions because they're target benefit plans. And what they're using are called going concern assumptions, and those are the long-term assumptions of the plan. These assumptions, discount rates assume equity, return, et cetera. But the bottom line is instead of a commuted value or a marriage breakdown value, which might be using, based on bond yields, might be using a 2 or 3% discount rate for the first 20 years, commuted values are often using 5.5%. So when you get a commuted value out of these shared risk plans, they're very, very low in many cases, like shockingly low. Like you can have a teacher in New Brunswick who's been there 20 years and their commuted value might come out like $250,000 or something, where it would be $900,000 in Ontario, but it's fundamentally very similar pension. And so there's been an increasing request from New Brunswick lawyers to say, wait a minute, they're cluing in, this is what's going on. How can I have I was assuming I had a big asset here. And all of a sudden, I'm getting told by the plan administrator the asset's pretty small. So we're doing independent valuations more on these pensions to sort of say, well, that's how the law is valuing these target benefit plans in New Brunswick, because it's allowing these certain assumptions to be used. But the independent actuarial evaluation say it's not a $250,000 pension, it's a $600,000 pension, and then the courts or the parties will have to decide what to do with that. But this is also an issue in Alberta. I testified 2 weeks ago on an Alberta case, exact same problem with the target benefit plan. There's definitely I would say that the pension legislation for target benefit plans, in my opinion, was not drafted putting too much weight on marriage breakdown. So I think marriage breakdown was a bit of an afterthought for these plans. And the general thinking in these plans is that they want the members to keep their money in the plan. So if the member terminates, they give them a low commuted value. Well, the member should just leave their money in the plan if they don't want the low commuted value. But they're not giving spouses a choice in these jurisdictions. They're saying, here's your low marriage breakdown value, which is the same value, and the spouse only gets half. And that the problem with that is that, of course, the former spouse doesn't have an option in most of these plans to get their own pension. Is this value supposed to be forced on the spouse, or is there another way around? So I would hope to see some legislative change in some of these provinces eventually, where it allows the former spouses to become limited members of these target benefit plans. That would solve the problem, let them get their own pension. But as it stands right now, one thing I would advise, if you're ever seeing commuted values coming out of, it's not in Ontario yet. Ontario is not permitting these target benefit plans to use their own assumptions, but in other provinces such as New Brunswick, Alberta, Saskatchewan, you'll see you might have a teacher, somebody who thought had a pension come back, and if the commuted value looks so low that you think it was an error, take a look at its target benefit plan. And if it is, that's why. And then you may start to have to think about, okay, is this really a fair value to be using for property settlement purposes? So having said that, I think target benefit plans are excellent. I'm glad that the industry is heading this direction. I think they solve a big problem for Canadians. It'll give Canadians access to defined benefit pensions. I think we're going to see a lot more Canadians with defined benefit pensions. It's just, I don't think they're fully thought through on the marriage breakdown front. And being family law professionals, we're being forced to deal with this now unfortunately, as these laws have been changing in the last 10 years. We have to do the best we can, in my opinion, to help the parties reach an equitable settlement that's fair to both the plan member and the spouse. In Quebec, it's kind of an odd one. Quebec, they generally accept the modified commuted value. That's just, the Quebec has the civil code. It's not a common law jurisdiction, so it's a little bit more codified. But for plans that aren't bound by it, I don't do work in Quebec, but from talking to actuaries, they apply the marriage breakdown standards to federal pension plans that are unbound, and that's a dramatically different valuation basis, but that's what they do. So it's a little bit like apples and oranges, but that's my understanding of how it functions in Quebec. Now, these groups of provinces that I described that are either deferred settlement or immediate settlement, they're not always purely one or the other. So as an example, many jurisdictions allow some aspect of either or. So BC, for example, so once a spouse becomes a limited member of a BC plan, they can keep their money in. And once the plan member reaches earliest unreduced age, which is usually 55, but it might be 50, if the former spouse doesn't want to they can either start their own pension separate of the member, or they can say, I want the commuted value. So they can instruct the plan to pay the commuted value out at that time. So BC's legislation is like I said, quite comprehensive. It really gives full options to the former spouse to do what they want. So that's an immediate settlement characteristic of the BC plan. So just because BC's deferred settlement, they do then again also allow the commuted value option if the spouse wants. Newfoundland always allows the members the choice. So as long as the member is not retired, once you fill out the forms for the spouse to become a limited member of a Newfoundland plan, this former spouse at any point can call the plan and say, I want to take the commuted value out now, and they can take it into a locked-in RSP. And then on the flip side, Saskatchewan, interestingly, although it generally just requires a commuted value, under their legislation, if the member's eligible for an unreduced pension at the time of the separation, the spouse can say, no, I don't want to, take my lump sum now. I want to leave it in a plan, and I'll take it later. So it's a form of a deferred settlement. So some of these jurisdictions have sort of done a bit of mixing of the characteristics of the two. But in general, I would say in general, the deferred settlement jurisdictions, I think, are a more equitable style of doing the division. So when somebody earns a defined benefit pension or any employment pension, their plan is going to be governed under certain jurisdictions. So there's going to be certain pension standards legislation that governs, their vesting and the marriage breakdown provisions and all of that. So it depends where they work. So if they're working in a non-federal industry, so they're not working for the federal government or they're not working for a federally regulated industry, which is like a bank or an airline, then it's provincial legislation and it matters which province they're working in. However, regardless of the province the employee is working in, if they work for like one of the big banks, CIBC, TD, Royal Bank, Air Canada, Bell Canada, Canada Post, these are all federally regulated industries. In that case, the pension standards legislation governing these federally regulated plans is this Federal Pension Benefit Standards Act. Or if they're federal government employees, and the federal government rules apply. So first, I want to talk about the federally regulated plan. So if you take, for example, a bank employee or a Canada Post employee, their plan is actually governed federally. Now, interestingly, in the territories in Canada, so I've spoken about all the provinces, but I haven't talked about Yukon, Nunavut, and Northwest Territories. In the three territories, they don't have their own pension standards legislation. Their employees, territorial employees, are all governed under this federal PBSA. So the federal PBSA applies to all federally regulated industries and employees in the three territories. And under this legislation, the federal PBSA, interestingly, up to 100% of the pension can be assigned to the former spouse. So the plan member can give their whole pension away. Also, the division rules under this standard vary a bit by plan to plan because the legislation is somewhat vague and the plans have decided to interpret them their own way. Usually, it's very flexible. So most plans, what they'll allow in this is if the member is not retired, the former spouse can get a lump sum. Yes, that's fine. The former spouse can get their own pension. Yes, that's fine. If the member is retired, many of these plans say, does the spouse want their own converted pension? That's fine. Does the spouse want to share the member's pension? That's fine. Most of them are very flexible. However, usually they have their own policy. So when I deal with one of these plans, be it Air Canada or Canada Post, usually want to ask, can you provide us with your pension division policy so you know what's possible and what's not possible under their plan? One of the curiosities in Canadian law I've learned doing this for 15 years now is there's some lack of agreement on the interaction between federal statutes and provincial statutes, especially in terms of overlapping jurisdictions. Fortunately for us, family law is one of those jurisdictions. So family law is a provincial matter. However, when you talk about division of pensions of federally regulated plans, the pension legislation is an employment benefit. It's federally regulated. So the question has always arisen for years now, if you have, say, an employee working in Ontario that works for a federally regulated company like Air Canada or one of the banks, does that bank have to implement the Ontario rules under the Ontario Pension Benefits Act? Because that plan's not bound by the Ontario Pension Benefits Act in general. And the answer is we don't have a clear answer. The regulator, OSFI, has given a fairly informal opinion that they believe that the plans do. But from my experience, a lot of plans have been ignoring that opinion. Some are, some aren't. It's really all over the map. So one thing about the federally regulated plans, I always say before, if the division is the way they want to go, it's always best to check with an actuary that you're working with to see if they know what the most recent policy is from the plan, or to call the plan and ask. I would ask, what options do you allow? Are you following the Ontario rules? Are you following the BC rules? And what do you require to have the pension divided? The reality is these plans are really all over the map. If the plan is saying, no, we don't abide by the provincial rules, we apply the federal only, that's not bad news, because the federal rules, as I have laid out on the slide, are very flexible. So they generally allow pretty much anything the spouse wants is doable, up to 100%, their own pension, a lump sum, usually very, very flexible. So I recently had a case, Royal Bank, where Royal Bank previously was allowing the spouses to either follow the Ontario rules or to follow the federal rules. Apparently they've changed their mind and said now you have to, Ontario employees of Royal Bank plans have to follow the Ontario rules, which is unfortunate because now they've lost a lot of flexibility because this system is much more flexible than the Ontario system. So they're forcing them to use the Ontario family law value and all of its requirements. When many of the other federal plans are saying, no, if you want to use this, refer to this legislation in your separation agreement, then we'll carry out whatever division you want. But these things are changing almost every year. I'm getting different information from different plans. So as they're plan administrators change and lawyers change within these companies, they seem to be making different policy decisions on this. So it's a little hard to keep track of. At least federal government is easier. Federal government has been the same for 30 years. If you have a federal government employee, and that includes all federal government employees, federal civil servants, RCMP, military, members of parliament, all of anyone who works for the federal government, they are governed, their pension legislation is entirely independent of the province. They have no obligation to carry out any provincial pension division scheme. So it's simple because we know what's going to happen. They are governed by the Federal Pension Benefits Division Act. We refer to this as the PBDA. So the PBDA governs all federal government employees' pension division on marriage breakdown. So if you have one employee who's, Border Services or, Canada Food Inspection Agency, anyone CRA, they all have the same legislation. The only option available to divide this pension anywhere in Canada is an immediate settlement lump sum transfer. And it's a lump sum transfer, whether the person's working, deferred, or retired. They all get lump sum transfers to a locked-in RSP. So one thing to keep in mind with a federal government employee of any sort, the former spouse can never receive their own pension. It is not possible with federal government. They do not permit it. It always has to be, the spouse will always have to take a lump sum transfer to a locked-in RSP. The lump sum transfer that the federal government calculates is called the maximum transferable amount, or the MTA, and it's half the value of the pension earned during marriage under the federal rules. It's not the same as necessarily the provincial rules. So independent actuaries value these pensions fairly often to give an apples to apples comparison to provincial pensions. And then you can, the MTA is just what can be transferred from the plan. It isn't necessarily the value on marriage breakdown. If you do have one of the, and the other thing I would point out with these, the PBDA, the federal government offers free estimates. So the member can call up and say, give me my estimated MTA, and they'll do it. Maybe 2 months later, they'll do it again. They always calculate it at the current date. It's not like the date of separation or a prior date. So that's problematic for many jurisdictions. The other thing is it's an estimate on a computer printout. And these things regularly have errors in them, I can tell you. They're not exactly vetted. And so I've seen separation agreements where they'll get this 2-page printout from the federal government and talking about $1 million pension, and then they'll do the settlement agreement based on that. It makes me very, very nervous if I were the lawyer that was involved in that, because that is not, the federal government has written all over it. They have not verified data. They are not verifying the calculation. The problem is they're only going to verify it if you request a division on the time they actually do the payment. Is the only time they're going to verify their calculation. So you cannot get the federal government to give you sort of a verified and sort of certified number of the pension ahead of time. It's not possible. So if you want to have a number that's been checked and verified, you really will need to have an actuary do a calculation with the federal government. All you're going to get from them is this estimated computer printout. So I just, while I was talking about, so that's sort of the overview of Canadian pension division. I just wanted to talk a bit about US and UK. So I spoke earlier about if you have a client who worked in multiple provinces, just keep in mind that their pension division rules that apply depends on where they worked when they earned the pension. That happens in the US as well. So I've had a number of clients over the years who worked for Canadian multinationals, and they've moved to the US and then back to Canada again. And they do have pensions in the US pension plan. Obviously, they do not follow Canadian pension or family law. You can't go to the US pension office and say, can you give us the Ontario family law value, or can you give us Canadian commuted value for our Manitoba separation? They won't do it, of course. In the US, to divide a pension, you need to do what's called a QDRO, or Qualified Domestic Relations Order. The problem with these for Canadians is that they require a judicial order in the US. So in order to have it, it can be done for Canadian. It doesn't matter that it's Canadian resident. The problem is that it needs to go through a US courts, has to sign off and certify the QDRO. For this reason, the cost of retaining a U.S. attorney and going through that process is often not desirable unless there's no other option. The pension's too valuable. And it's usually in these cases, it's much simpler to hire an independent actuary to put a value on it and to then offset it against other assets, because the process of dividing it at source for a Canadian resident is challenging and costly. But it can be done. So if they do want to do it, it can be done. U.S. Social Security, I'm involved once in a while in this. U.S. Social Security is a very bizarre animal. It cannot be divided. There's no credit splitting like in Canada, nothing like that. but it has extremely generous benefits for like divorced spouses. So as long as the marriage is over 10 years, and oddly, this like in the US, a member of Social Security can have multiple spouses. I think they have like many spouses. So if they keep remarrying, a lot of spouses can keep receiving like 50% of their pension with no impact to their pension. But it is a very valuable, U.S. Social Security is quite valuable if you look at the accrual of the pension. So if you have an individual who's been married last 10 years, maybe worked in the US for 5, 6, 7 years, was a high income earner, their Social Security pension can be relatively valuable. So it's something you may want to think about if you've had somebody working in the US, is to find out whether they have a US Social Security benefit. And the only way to deal with it is either you don't, or you have to have it valued and offset because there's no ability to divide it. The other pensions I see often enough are UK. Anyone who's immigrated from the UK or may have spent time working in the UK. The UK had quite a number of, it was quite large amount of defined benefit pension plans historically. So a lot of employees were covered by defined benefit pension plans in the UK for many years. So if somebody has worked or came from the UK, often does have a defined benefit pension. And so they often, again, I'm involved in valuing these and to avoid having to try to divide them at source, because again, to divide a UK pension at source, it's possible for a Canadian resident, but requires generally, from all the plans I've seen, an order of a UK court. So you're in the same problem with the US QDRO. It's problematic and costly to actually divide them at source and give the spouse their own separate pension. What the UK will provide you, though, if you ask for the marriage breakdown statement, most UK pension plans, because of the UK regulations and law, will provide you what's called a CETV. So if you've ever seen one from a UK pension plan, they're called cash equivalent transfer values. It's basically the UK equivalent of the Canadian commuted value, but it's different assumptions. So from my experience checking these, and I've done quite a number of them, sometimes they're relatively close to the commuted value if you convert from British pounds into Canadian dollars, and sometimes they're not. Technically, for example, in Ontario, they should still be valued under the Ontario family law rules, because every pension in Ontario is supposed to be valued under the Ontario family law rules, regardless of jurisdiction. So foreign, you get an actuary to do their best, and the family law act's quite clear in section 2.1, apples to apples comparison amongst all pensions. But in other jurisdictions, for example, in Manitoba or New Brunswick, arguably, I think the courts, knowing that if they were explained that the CETV is basically the UK equivalent of the commuted value, and they're using commuted value for their pensions generally, it might be quite agreeable to using a CETV as the basis for the value on marriage breakdown. As an actuary, we would advise that you have an actuary involved to do a proper valuation under Canadian standards, of course. But being realistic, I know that it's not that uncommon in various jurisdictions for the parties to get the CETV from the UK plan administrator and to use it. But again, usually it would be used to offset the value of the pension because to divide it at source would require generally a UK court order. So again, a little bit problematic. So I wanted to leave some time at the end. I guess I have 10 minutes here for questions. So I'm going to open the floor for questions. And anyone have any questions, just raise your hand or speak up.
I'm just wondering, like in terms of the pensions, is when there's a supplementary plan?
Yep.
Does it change much in terms of the options? Like, can you get, supplementary portion paid a different way versus the defined regular legislative pension amount?
Yeah, so the reason I don't have supplemental, I had to decide what to put in and what not to put in. The supplemental pension plans are not governed by pension standards legislation. That's specifically why they're supplemental, because they're usually in excess per the Income Tax Act. So as a result of that, there's actually no governing legislation as to how they're dealt with. So there are no rules as to how that's done. So what ends up happening from what I've seen is the company will make its own administrative decision as to how they do that. So okay. I'll give you an example. So Ontario Power Generation goes right to the point of when you request your Ontario Family Law value, they'll give you a second one for the supplemental, and they'll let you, they'll pay it out as a cash payment to the former spouse, taxable cash payment. So they go the whole way and say, we'll deal with it exactly like we do at the registered. That's their choice. They're not required to do that. Many of the private sector ones I've seen will do nothing, or they'll give you a statement saying, this is how much the pension's earned. We won't divide it at source. Can't be assigned to the spouse, go off and deal with it, in which case an independent actuary would need to value it and offset it. So it's a very good question. So with supplemental pensions, you really would have to contact the plan administrator or the company and ask them what options are available and can the pension be assigned. And my experience is, aside from the sort of crown corporation type plans, I've never seen a private sector supplemental plan that allowed an assignment to a spouse. Everyone I've seen prohibits it. So the problem is, it's the member's pension. The plan is not bound by pension standards legislation. And we're always stuck in the situation where it has to be valued and then shared. So either you value it and they offset it, but I've had several cases where the supplemental pension was too valuable. So what we had to do is we had to do an if and when agreement in the separation agreement, where in retirement, the exec was going to have to write a check to the spouse, for their share of the pension once it was received, because we didn't have any other way around. And just as a comment, OMERS, surprisingly, OMERS has an RCA, like a supplemental, and OMERS will not assign to the former spouse. So OMERS says, no, we don't abide by the rules. We don't assign to former spouse. So with supplemental pension plans, I would advise you be careful when you have high earners, if there is one. And if there is one, you have to ask the company what's possible. Unfortunately, my experience is generally they aren't very helpful. It's usually back to the lawyers and the actuaries to work through it.
Okay, yeah, that was my question, because I had an experience. In this case, they were actually already in receipt of the pension, so that probably made it a little easier. But it was very difficult dealing with the company on that piece of it. And I just found, in terms of the individuals, there was a lot of legal fees involved because of that piece. But it was significant, as you said, they could be very significant.
Like the amount of money that has been spent on the cases I've been involved in with big supplementals on legal and actuarial fees is very, very significant, unfortunately. That's why if it was in pay, one option would be to say, depending on how comfortable the parties were to be, say, call it spousal support and deal with his spousal. It's got a lot of problems with that, of course, but the parties do need to be aware. I agree with you. If you're going to do it from a legal actuarial point, it's very expensive, and the companies are not usually helpful.
In this case, the company agreed to split it at source, actually.
Oh, good. That's good.
But the spouse wanted the commuted value, so there was a lot of time and money spent back and forth on that, which at the end was unsuccessful anyways.
As far as my concern, the fact that they split it at source, great. You wanted the commuted value. That's like asking for the gold castle and a supplement.
Yeah.
It's very rare. It's very rare. But yeah, OPG does do that. But yeah, very rare.
I would have a question. I'm not sure. Can I? It's Bettina from BC. So I have two pensions. They are with the local health care provider, and they both work in very different positions. And the evaluation of the pension actually turned out that the husband has a 200,030 share in the wife's pension, and she has only 130,000 share in his pension. So she would like to keep as much as possible of her pension, but there's not enough cash. Would it be fair to say that if both keep their pension, she has to give him 100,000? And if she has like 50,000, she only have to give him 50,000. Is it fair to proportion it like that? Yeah,
100%. So I do a lot of work in BC. So the only thing to be careful of when you're doing that is make sure you're doing after-tax assets to after-tax assets and pre-tax to pre-tax. That would be my only qualification there. But yeah, so I actually quite frequently work with, say, BC. One's BC Municipal, the other one's BC Public Service. One is worth compensation payment owing for spouse A to B is 300,000, from spouse B to A is 200,000. It's $100,000 difference. And what I always suggest is, well, you could divide both pensions and make them limited members of each plan and each get 50. Or why don't you keep the one pension intact? It's simpler. and then you reduce how much the spouse gets. So under BC, the default is 50% proportionate share of the service earned during marriage, but you can specify an alternate percentage in your separation agreement. So we'll do the calculation. What's the amount owing divided by the value of the pension? Maybe instead of 50%, you give them 22%. And often the member likes that because they say, okay, well, that's a much lower reduction to my pension in retirement. And the spouse likes that because they keep their pension. And from a separation point of view, just simpler, you're only dividing one pension, so the other one doesn't need the forms filed and all of that. But yep, that's done all the time, and we do advise it. It can be a streamlined approach to dealing with the pensions.
Okay, thank you. And can I ask another question?
Sure.
So with the pensions in pay, I mean, I realize that there's different life expectancy and such things, but for simplicity, basically the couple can make the decision, either look at it as an asset or look at it as support, right?
Well, we usually, okay, I've had this question.
Income,
so
sorry.
when there's when the pension's in pay, often people say, well, can we deal with it as spousal support, like deal with it as an income stream versus an asset?
Yes.
Now, in pension standards family law legislation across Canada, the pension is always an asset. So it's not correct. And there's a difference between dealing with it as an asset versus support in terms of security for the former spouse. So in many jurisdictions, depending how you're dealing with it, it's more security to have this permanent assignment with the plan, that the spouse is literally assigned it on a legal basis, versus support where there might be a variance in support down the road if something happens, et cetera. So I'm always a little nervous when lawyers go down that road, or the mediators. I always say just the client should be aware that's technically not correct, because the pensions are assets, and to divide the pension as an asset, you have to do the division, which is dividing the asset itself, which is she's got a legal entitlement to half of the pension earned during marriage. She's not getting it as part of a support agreement under the support. However, in practice, it does happen sometimes when the parties disagree, that they understand those issues and agree that it's simpler to just deal with it as support. Makes me always a little nervous, but yes, in practice that does happen. But my perspective always is if dealing with a client, I would just advise you strongly explain to them the difference between the two and make sure they understand the difference between, because if they're going to deal with it as support, they could just do the pension assignment and then reduce the income used for support purposes. I know it's one extra step, but so they understand the difference between doing it the two ways, I think would be important. But yes, that does happen.
Thank you.
There's a question that was put in the chat. So how do you determine if your client has a traditional DB plan or a target DB plan, and are all multiple employer plans the target plan, and how do clients find this out?
Yeah, so that's a little tricky to find out, actually. So it's not as obvious. Not all multi-employer plans are, because you do have the big multi-employer plans, like I said, like Ontario Teachers, OMERS. Most smaller multi-employer plans these days are target benefit. The way to find out usually is either on the annual statement from the member, or if the plan has a website, it'll always say it on the website. If you look at the booklet, they'll talk about the governance structure of the plan, and they'll refer to it as either a shared risk target benefit style pension plan. So usually you have to go digging through the documentation. If you're really not sure what you're dealing with, I would just suggest you reach out to whichever actuary you're using and ask them the question. Just send them the statement or ask them about the pension plan that if you're unable to determine, an actuary can help you figure that out.
That's great, thanks.
Hi, Jamie. Question for you. Is there a sort of quick and dirty way of estimating what somebody's resulting pension income will be based on how much they may be transferring from their pension? I know you've done some detailed work for me in the past, but is there, we're just trying to do a quick estimate for somebody. Is there a magic?
So of the residual pension for the plan member, or what the spouse is going to get?
No, for the plan member.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if the pensions, I mean, really roughly speaking, I would just take a look at their half of the service earned during marriage divided by their total service at retirement. That would be the reduction. So for example, say if they're in a 20-year marriage and you're giving the spouse half, so you're going to lose 10 years. And at retirement, they're going to have 30 years. Then they're going to lose 10 out of 1/3. So I'd roughly 2/3. It's really rough because you're not factoring future salary increases and all of that. But if they're relatively close to retirement, that'll get you pretty close. I would just, because remember, like I was saying before, we know what they're prorating on service. So all pension reductions in Canada are prorating on service. So they're always fundamentally using that basis. So as a really rough guide, that's what I would say. Sometimes you get these close to retirement, whatever they are, Air Canada pilot or whatever, and they say, well, retiring next year, how much am I going to lose in my pension? You've been with Air Canada 30 years, you were married 20 of your years, you're giving her 10 years, 10 out of 30, you're going to do 2/3, be pretty close. If they're younger and they're, then obviously if you do that approach, you're probably overestimating the reduction because they'll have earnings increases and everything else. But yeah, it's a rough way to go. And if you want an exact calculation, like you said, you're going to reach out to an actuary who can do a more precise projection. But
Okay, great, thanks.
And on that line, one thing I've noticed is that sometimes you have two sides of that coin. So on one hand, I have some clients who are very attached to defined benefit pension, and they say, "Oh, I don't want to give it up. It's mine, and they do everything like under the sun. They want to, the house goes to her, and this goes to her. And at some point, you kind of maybe say, I love it. I'm big believer in defined benefit pensions, but at some point, it gets a little bit extreme. So sometimes to help them come to terms with the fact that there might need to be assignment from their beloved defined benefit pension. Sometimes the projections Eve is talking about are very helpful because you can listen, like if you can limit how much you're assigning, don't give the full 50%, maybe we'll give 200,000 or something from the plan. And then you do show them what it looks like on a net basis as well, because it's a marginal tax rate. And they were like, oh, it's only like $30 a month. I can live with that. So are you going to, piece together, have no financing for your new home and, be living out of a cardboard box? Or are you going to lose, $30 a month from your pension and have a more reasonable settlement? So sometimes those sort of projections can help sort of spouses come to terms with, because I understand if you've worked for 30 years, you value this pension greatly, and all of a sudden you're terrified because you think if I sign this agreement, I'm losing a ton of my pension. So quantifying what the impact will be for the plan member is often extremely helpful to coming to terms agreement and a separation agreement. So that they understand in their terms what the division reduction means to them. You could say, oh, it's going to be 5 years, it's going to be 20%, and they're still thinking, I don't know what that means. So to help them to decide and come to terms with a more appropriate settlement. And like you said, you can either approximate it yourself to help them say, listen, it's not like you're not losing, you might only lose 10%, you're losing 10%, so of your pension, you can live with that. So that I find is a pretty good way to go. And also the other way, sometimes former spouses want the house or whatever, and they're refusing to get the pension. And sometimes, I often recommend they reach out to sort of CFAs and say, listen, but are you gonna have any retirement income? You're gonna be house rich, and maybe there's a need. So I find sometimes communication on pensions and helping them understand it in their terms is really helpful to reaching a settlement.
That's great. Any other questions? We've still got Jamie for a few minutes if anybody has a burning question. And we'll send the tests out tomorrow.
I have one question.
Go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Sorry, I had technical problems earlier. You mentioned at one point, like I had a pension valuation just recently where there's two different values because it was already in pay. One being with an amount for survivor benefit, and then one without.
Mm-hmm.
And again, trying to get information from this pension provider was like pulling teeth. So we kind of made some assumptions based on what we found within the pension booklets and so on. But I guess my biggest question was, and I don't know if I was right or wrong, was at the time that the pensioner passes away, does she receive the spousal amount, but only up to a limit of 50%, not the full 65?
Which juris, where you could tell me which pension plan this was or which province?
It was called the local 6655 or something like that.
Okay, and which province was the
Ontario. It was out of Sarnia.
Oh, okay, so that would be a target benefit plan. So that'd be a local. That would be one of these multi. So, okay, say by law in Ontario, the minimum survivor pension is 60%. But
Yes.
sometimes the standard form is 50, and they can sign down so they don't lose as much of their pension. The answer is unless the fiscal or FSRA now has a spousal waiver form. I don't know if you're aware of it. So they can in Ontario waive the survivor pension,
Yes.
which is usually a very bad idea in many cases. But if that form is not completed, then the survivor pension is vested in the spouse at retirement. So the answer is yes. So if she was the elder, it was a she that was the spouse, I'm assuming.
Well, so the other thing was, so I'll give you some more context, which is why it was confusing for us. There was a 19-year difference between the two of them.
Yep.
So the first amount was like $1,840.
Yeah.
Plus the spousal, benefit, or $1,934, but no spousal.
Yeah.
Right. And they gave us an actual value of how much that survivor benefit was, which would end up being $160,000.
Yeah.
And so, again, if I was wrong, please tell me. They ended up doing something completely different. But my analogy for them was, well, why was there only like a $90 difference? It was like, well, I'm going to go on a limb here that your 160 is this big pile of money, and because you're so young, we're dragging it over a long period of time. And if you wait until he passes away, then that kind of gets pushed together, and then eventually gets paid out. So, but there was a cap of the cap of 160 was what confused everybody. So I had the lawyer saying, well, that can be transferred. I'm like, I don't think it can. So
was it a family law value you got for that? Yeah. So I mean, the value of the survivor pension for a young, when there's a big age difference between the spouses, the survivor pension is very valuable because of what's basically you're saying is that the survivor pension is vested in the spouse, and the spouse is 18 years younger. So there's a high probability it's going to be paid, and there's a high probability it's going to be paid for many years. So the reality is the actual present value reflects the survivor pension likely coming into payment in whatever 5 or 10 years, and then being paid for another 20 years because he's so much younger than he is. So yes, and no, it can't be paid out. They're just putting a value on that survivor protection. And when you have a very big difference in like I've had cases, I had one recently where they got married a year before retirement, and the guy married someone 25 years younger than him. So when the family law value comes back, his family law value is like, the pension's worth 800,000, but only whatever 50 grand if it was earned during marriage. So he's got $50,000 family law value. Her survivor pension was like 250,000 because she's so much younger than him. So the reality is she owes him money for the pension because survivor pension is so valuable. Can the money for the survivor pension be paid out? No. Survivor pension can't even be divided on Ontario law. It has to be equalized unless she's going to waive it. One of the problems with waiving it is if you look at plans like teachers, Ontario Public Service Pension Plan, the survivor pension is free. So it doesn't cost them anything. So you're basically, once you waive it, it's gone. So if you waive it, you're throwing away that pot of money, but no, it can't be paid out. It's just quantifying the value of the likely expected payments to that much younger spouse. And sometimes these young spouses have some difficulty with this when they have this massive asset on their side of the balance sheet for an asset. They say, wait a minute, maybe it'll never be paid, but actuarially speaking, using the actuarial mortality tables, it's very likely to be paid. And in fact, it's very likely to be paid for many years. So it has a very high value.
Gotcha. Okay.
Oh, may I jump in?
Yep, go ahead, Peter.
I've got this comment. When facing this problem, I've always thought that in reality, signing the survivors away doesn't really help the non-pensioner spouse because it existed at separation. And if it's existed at separation, you can't take it off the NFP unless the pensioner consents. So this business of sign it away and get rid of it, and then you don't have to worry about it, I think legally doesn't hold up. All you're really doing is asking for a big favor from the pensioner. And if the pensioner is willing to do the big favor of like forgetting about the survivors, then let the non-pensioner spouse keep the survivors because it is so valuable, and let the non-pensioner spouse give the pensioner some big favor somewhere else in the settlement.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, Peter. In most of these plans, I agree with you 100%. And I cringe when they start talking about waiving the survivor pension. And I agree, because part of it is even if the spouse wants to waive it, it's sort of, if it never can be given to another spouse, which is generally the case. I mean, so one spouse can take an investment account of 100,000 and throw it in a bin and light it on fire and say, oh, no, it no longer exists. You know, it really is, it concerns me because it's, and I agree with you that it existed at separation and the spouse is just unilaterally deciding to waive it. No, I agree with that comment. It's a troubling situation though, when you get a spouse who's just determined, you know, they don't want that survivor pension on their sheet. And sometimes I try to explain the value of the survivor pension to both, and the spouse say it's really important, because if they, you know, if he gets hit by a bus tomorrow, you get that for the rest of your life. You know, it might be a very, very valuable source. But yes, I agree with Peter.
You know what? I'll just say one last thing. I think this is a glitch in the Ontario pension division system for in-pay pensions, because the non-pensioner spouse has no escape from the situation you just described. Like, you're stuck with the 250,000 on your side of the NFP.
Yeah.
And really, they should come up with something that allows a sort of internal transfer of value to the pension, you know, to give the pensioner even more pension as, you know, compensation for, you know, the survivors. But anyway.
Yeah, I've always thought it was a glitch, because the problem is that, or allow it to be converted, like combination option should be mandatory or something. You got to allow spouses in this situation to keep the value and maybe convert it into a lifetime pension for the spouse or something that's more agreeable to them. I agree. It's a problem. It's another problem we have to deal with. There's lots of problems with the Ontario rules, I guess, in practice, but yeah. I agree with that. Any other questions?
Probably after you leave there will be, but.
Well, my contact information is on the slide, so you can reach out to me if, and I'll send the slides to Linda right after we're done, and she can share it with the group.
Yeah.
So if you have any questions on a specific case, feel free to reach out to me.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Jamie. I think everybody's been enlightened quite considerably with all the things that you've provided for us, and I'm sure they'll put it into practice. So thanks very much.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Yeah. Bye-bye.